Chapter 10. The word arna corresponds with our plural men. Arn, the singular, with man. The word for woman is gi. It forms itself into ge for the plural, the g being soft in the plural form. They have a proverb to the effect that this difference in pronunciation is symbolical, for that the female sex is soft in the concrete, but hard to deal with in the individual. The ge are in the fullest enjoyment of all the rights of equality with males, for which certain philosophers above ground contend. In childhood, they perform the offices of work and labor impartially with the boys, and indeed, in the earlier age appropriated to the destruction of animals irreclaimably hostile, the girls are frequently preferred, as being, by constitution, more ruthless under the influence of fear or hate. In the interval between infancy and the marriageable age, familiar intercourse between the sexes is suspended. At the marriageable age it is renewed, never with worse consequences than those which attend upon marriage. All arts and vocations allotted to the one sex are open to the other, and the ge arrogate to themselves a superiority in all those abstruse and mystical branches of reasoning, for which they say the arna are unfitted by a duller sobriety of reasoning, or the routine of their matter-of-fact occupations, just as young ladies in our own world constitute themselves authorities on the subtlest points of theological doctrine, for which few men, actively engaged in worldly business, have sufficient learning or refinement of intellect. Whether owing to early training in gymnastic exercises or to their constitutional organization, the ge are usually superior to the arna in physical strength, an important element in the consideration and maintenance of female rights. They attain to loftier stature, and amid their rounder proportions are embedded sinews and muscles as hardy as those of the other sex. Indeed, they assert that, according to the original laws of nature, females were intended to be larger than males, and maintain this dogma by reference to the earliest formations of life in insects, and in the most ancient family of the vertebrata, namely fishes, in both of which the females are generally large enough to make a meal of their consorts, if they so desire. Above all, the ge have a readier and more concentrated power over that mysterious fluid or agency which contains the element of destruction, with a larger portion of that sagacity which comprehends dissimulation. Thus they cannot only defend themselves against all aggressions from the males, but could, at any moment when he least expected his danger, terminate the existence of an offending spouse. To the credit of the ge, no instance of their abuse of this awful superiority in the art of destruction is on record for several ages. The last that occurred in the community I speak of appears, according to their chronology, to have been about 2,000 years ago. A ge, then in a fit of jealousy, slew her husband, and this abominable act inspired such terrors among the males that they emigrated in a body and left all the ge to themselves. The history runs that the widowed ge, thus reduced to despair, fell upon the murderess when in her sleep, and therefore unarmed, and killed her, and then entered into a solemn obligation amongst themselves to abrogate forever the exercise of their extreme conjugal powers, and to inculcate the same obligation for ever and ever on their female children. By this conciliatory process, a deputation despatched to the fugitive consorts succeeded in persuading many to return, but those who did return were mostly the elder ones. The younger, either from too craven a doubt of their consorts or too high an estimate of their own merits, rejected all overtures, and, remaining in other communities, were caught up there by other mates, with whom, perhaps, they were no better off. But the loss of so large a portion of the male youth operated as a salutary warning on the ge, and confirmed them in the pious resolution to which they pledged themselves. Indeed, it is now popularly considered that, by long hereditary disuse, the Gei have lost both the aggressive and defensive superiority over the Arna which they once possessed, just as in the inferior animals above the earth many peculiarities in their original formation, intended by nature for their protection, gradually fade or become inoperative when not needed under altered circumstances. I should be sorry, however, for any Arn who induced a Gei to make the experiment whether he or she were the stronger. From the incident I have narrated, the Arna date certain alterations in the marriage customs, tending, perhaps, somewhat to the advantage of the male. They now bind themselves in wedlock only for 3 years. At the end of each 3rd year, either male or female can divorce the other and is free to marry again. At the end of 10 years, the Arn has the privilege of taking a second wife, allowing the first to retire if she so please. These regulations are for the most part a dead letter. Divorces and polygamy are extremely rare, and the marriage state now seems singularly happy and serene among this astonishing people. The Gei, notwithstanding their boastful superiority in physical strength and intellectual abilities, being much curbed into gentle manners by the dread of separation or of a second wife, and the Arna being very much the creatures of custom, and not, except under great aggravation, likely to exchange for hazardous novelties faces and manners to which they are reconciled by habit. But there is one privilege the Gei carefully retain, and the desire for which perhaps forms the secret motive of most lady asserters of woman rights above ground. They claim the privilege, here usurped by men, of proclaiming their love and urging their suit. In other words, of being the wooing party rather than the wooed. Such a phenomenon as an old maid does not exist among the Gei. Indeed, it is very seldom that a Gei does not secure any Arn upon whom she sets her heart, if his affections be not strongly engaged elsewhere. However coy, reluctant, and prudish the male she courts may prove at first, yet her perseverance, her ardor, her persuasive powers, her command over the mystic agencies of vril, are pretty sure to run down his neck into what we call the fatal noose. Their argument for the reversal of that relationship of the sexes, which the blind tyranny of man has established on the surface of the earth, appears cogent, and is advanced with a frankness which might well be commended to impartial consideration. They say that of the two, the female is by nature of a more loving disposition than the male, that love occupies a larger space in her thoughts, and is more essential to her happiness, and that therefore she ought to be the wooing party, that otherwise the male is a shy and dubitant creature, that he has often a selfish predilection for the single state, that he often pretends to misunderstand tender glances and delicate hints, that, in short, he must be resolutely pursued and captured. They add, moreover, that unless the Gei can secure the Arn of her choice, and one whom she would not select out of the whole world becomes her mate, she is not only less happy than she otherwise would be, but she is not so good a being that her qualities of heart are not sufficiently developed. Whereas the Arn is a creature that less lastingly concentrates his affections on one object, that if he cannot get the Gei whom he prefers, he easily reconciles himself to another Gei, and finally, that at the worst, if he is loved and taken care of, it is less necessary to the welfare of his existence that he should love as well as be loved. He grows contented with his creature comforts, and the many occupations of thought which he creates for himself. Whatever may be said as to this reasoning, the system works well for the male, for being thus sure that he is truly and ardently loved, and that the more coy and reluctant he shows himself, the more determination to secure him increases, he generally contrives to make his consent dependent on such conditions as he thinks the best calculated to ensure, if not a blissful, at least a peaceful life. Each individual Arn has his own hobbies, his own ways, his own predilections, and whatever they may be, he demands a promise of full and unrestrained concession to them. This, in the pursuit of her object, the Gi readily promises, and as the characteristic of this extraordinary people is an implicit veneration for truth, and her word, once given, is never broken even by the giddiest Gi, the conditions stipulated for are religiously observed. In fact, notwithstanding all their abstract rights and powers, the Gi are the most amiable, conciliatory, and submissive wives I have ever seen even in the happiest households above ground. It is an aphorism among them that where a Gi loves, it is her pleasure to obey. It will be observed that in the relationship of the sexes I have spoken only of marriage, for such is the moral perfection to which this community has attained, that any illicit connection is as little possible amongst them as it would be to a couple of linnets during the time they agree to live in pairs.